Good morning, and welcome to Sustainable Energy Hawaii's webinar on geothermal energy. My name is Noel Morin. I'm a board member of the organization. I have the honor of moderating today's event. Throughout this session, you will have the chance to send in questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we will attempt to get to them, all of them throughout the event and during the Q&A panel. Any questions that we don't get to will be answered and included in the post-event email. SEH is focused on enabling renewable, affordable energy for Hawaii Island. We look for solutions that balance economic, environmental, and equity concerns. This is a journey of discovery, an opportunity to learn about geothermal energy. Yes, this is controversial and polarizing in some cases, and there are many reasons for this. Our hope is that through this series, and this is going to be one of several, we'll have collectively a better understanding of this resource and how it can be leveraged in a manner that is meaningful from an environmental, social, and economic perspective. Today, we will be discussing the rationale for this exploration, the science and tech involved, and the various considerations associated with geothermal energy production. The webinar on the 19th will be a deeper dive into concerns and obstacles and what might be needed to address them. So this is today's program. First, we'll hear from Richard Ha. He'll be expressing the SEH mission in a pre-recorded statement. We'll follow this with an informative video that one of our board members created on energy reality. We'll then have presentations by a number of individuals, Dr. Don Thomas, Dr. Nicole Lautze, Mike Kaleikini, Mililani Trask. Rep Lowen is also going to be here to share some perspectives on relevant policy and regulations. And these presentations will be followed by a Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing now, and we'll kick this off with an introduction by Richard Ha.
Welcome to Sustainable Energy Hawaii's webinar, titled Geothermal Power, Options for Hawaii's Energy Future. I'm Richard Ha. I own Hamakua Springs Country Farm and Mauna Kea Bananas, and farmed here on this island for about 45 years. My family is Kamahele from Maku'u. I am the great-great-great-grandson of Kamahele Nui, who in 1897 signed the Ku'e petition protesting the U.S. annexation of Hawaii. This is the first of the series of webinars. Today's is about geothermal. Others will focus on Mauna Kea and on the Mauna Honua Culture and Science Center above the clouds, which we want to see happen. It was Master Navigator Kalepa Hawaiian who suggested that name for it. The purpose of this webinar series is to talk about what decisions we can make now to improve conditions in Hawaii so our youth don't keep leaving to raise their children elsewhere. More Hawaiians live outside of Hawaii than live in the islands now. We want to make things better here, so there's a real choice. How do we improve conditions on Hawaii Island? We do it by being very smart about using our considerable resources, such as geothermal energy and Mauna Kea, which provides the best view of the heavens anywhere in the whole world. We can improve conditions here by rebranding Hawaii Island so it's a place of science and quality, not just sun and surf. We're very fortunate here to have those two incredible resources. The world reached what some call peak fossil fuels in 2018, but geothermal, which we'll be talking about today, will be available to us for 1 to 2 million years, and it's free energy. It will help to protect us from the volatility associated with fossil fuel prices. For green electricity, we can make green hydrogen and ammonia. The possibilities are very exciting. It means we could be very competitive to the US mainland here in Hawaii. The other resource is about having a place where we can peer into the skies, into the future, to explore new horizons, just as our Polynesian navigators did on the ocean. Mauna Kea is widely acknowledged to be the best place on the earth to see into the heavens, and it too will be available to us over the next million years, and it's also free. We can make it so that viewing the heavens has minimal impact on the island. These are amazing resources that most places don't have. We need to make the effort now to take the gifts given to us and incorporate them into how we live and into our economy. That will substantially benefit all of us and our quality of life for many generations to come. Hawaiians have already successfully integrated science and culture for more than 1,000 years. If you study how pre-contact Hawaiians looked at their economy, they took what we now call a physical science ecology approach. They balanced their needs and resources and supported a large population very successfully. It's similar to what is called biophysical economics on the mainland. It's a science-based view of economics. See The Great Simplification.com by Nate Higgins. TheGreatSimplification.com. But it's not only about the science, it's also about cultural concerns. Placing a culture and science center above the cloud is a way we can not only nourish our Hawaiian ways and values, but also present them to the rest of the world. 4 important plans have just come together recently that will affect what happens next. And they require that any changes be made with great attention to cultural integrity. First is the 10-year analysis of the Comprehensive Management Plan. Second is the UACLA Master Plan. Third is the federal government's most recent decadal survey, which declares the 30-meter telescope and the Magellan telescope in Chile to be federal priorities. And fourth, that of the Mauna Kea Management Working Group. Each one of these solutions require a respect for the Hawaiian culture. It's a critical time to make plans for geothermal, Mauna Kea, and the Mauna Honua Culture Science Center above the clouds. The Mauna Honua Culture and Science Center we want to see built is on DLNR lands west of the Visitor Information Station and facing the sunset. It would be completely separate from the University of Hawaii. We want to create this culture and science center where present and future generations of Hawaiians can do research and practice, cultural preservation, education, language, science, and ecology. The Bishop Museum could be a part of this. It will help us brand Hawaii as a place of top-level science and quality. Some worry it wouldn't be safe to bring more people up the mountain, but we have time to make it safe. This won't happen tomorrow. Maybe we run 4-wheel drive hydrogen buses up there. There are other possibilities. There's time to figure all that out. The bottom line is that it's time to address all 3 of these issues in positive, cost-effective ways that will improve life for our grandchildren and their grandchildren. Here's something to think about. Future generations will look back and judge us by what we do now with the resources we have available, because it will impact how they are living. They will look back at us because we are their ancestors. We have a responsibility to do right by them by making smart decisions today. So that was the big picture. Thank you for being here today. We are now focusing on geothermal. Aloha.
Thank you, Mr. Ha, for sharing that vision and mission of SEH. Before we start this video, I just wanted to share that an understanding of our global energy supply and demand and what's required for us to decarbonize our economy is very critical for us to be able to solve major problems like climate change. This video that we're now about to see was recently published to contribute to this understanding. And thanks to Peter Sternlicht, board member, for getting this together. Let's roll the video.
Modern Energy 101. Albert Einstein famously said, "Everything is energy, and that's all there is to it." This isn't philosophy, it's physics. The science of physics defines energy as the capacity to do work. Regardless of the form that's used, energy literally is what powers everything we do in life. Curtail any of what's in use today, and the entire system begins to weaken. At Sustainable Energy Hawaii, we believe it's essential our community have a greater overall understanding about energy. Due to the climate emergency, major decisions are currently being made about our energy future. The question of whether they're sustainable over the long term isn't really a discussion we've had in depth yet. To that end, we're convinced geothermal has a prominent role to play in our energy future. Today, there's a race to decarbonize the global economy. The lion's share of this effort is focused on solar and wind in combination with battery storage. All of these are valuable, essential, and achievable near-term solutions. At SEH, we wholeheartedly support these efforts, However, we know that solutions with longer life cycles are critical as well. Hawaii has very different energy challenges compared to those being confronted on the large continental land masses. Each Hawaiian island is small, isolated, and the physical space that can be devoted to renewable energy production is limited or in conflict with other public, private, or cultural interests. None of our islands have interconnected grid systems, and the relatively small size for each power plant keeps them from enjoying the economies of scale seen elsewhere in the world. These conditions and more contribute to the high price we all pay for power. To put the potential of geothermal power into context, we should take a broad look at the basics of energy and then evaluate our expectations as humanity goes through its first major energy transition in more than a century. At the outset, it's important we understand that not all energy is created equal. By this I mean we use distinctly different types of energy to satisfy different needs, each requiring different concentrations of raw power. Broadly, there are three well-defined forms of energy used to support civilization as we know it. For example, we have one form that's specifically used for transportation, another that powers static infrastructure, such as our homes, commercial buildings, and public spaces, and then a third, often left out of the energy category altogether, food. Transportation is primarily powered by petroleum and tends to come in various types of liquid fuel. Gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and marine gas oil are good examples. Even with the advent of EVs, 96% of all transportation used to move people and goods around the world is still powered by liquid, petroleum-based fossil fuels. Today, there is no alternative at scale. Solar cannot power container ships. Windmills cannot power the mining equipment needed to secure the raw materials used to build renewable systems in the first place. This should begin to illustrate the scale needed to transform global energy supplies to renewables, especially if continuous growth on a finite planet remains the default business model. Our second energy type is electric power. At its most basic, generating electricity has been very simple. We've just needed some kind of continuous flowing force to spin a turbine generator. In recent history, that's come from burning fossil fuels like coal, natural gas, or petroleum to produce the heat needed to boil water. That in turn produces pressurized steam that spins power-generating turbines. Current data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration shows that 61% of U.S. power production still comes from fossil fuels. The remaining 39% are renewables and comes from a mix of hydro, nuclear, wind, solar, and biofuels. Even though renewable energy growth is quite strong, it's only projected to satisfy a little more than half of the growth in overall energy demand during 2021 and 2022. The rest will come from increased fossil fuel use. The third type of energy I want to discuss today is the energy that powers you and me and all of our domesticated animals, food. Today, it's estimated that 90% of the food consumed across the Hawaiian Islands arrives by petroleum-powered cargo ships. Virtually all that food is grown using some combination of equipment and fertilizers that is derived from fossil fuels. The existential crisis, that is climate change, demands we rapidly replace our fossil fuel energy consumption with low-carbon or no-carbon alternatives. To be successful while being economically viable, our energy solutions must support the ability to move goods and people from place to place on an industrial scale. Currently, that ability is limited to liquid fossil fuels. It's the lifeblood of the global economy. One of the biggest hurdles in meeting our climate mitigation goals is that liquid fuels contain more concentrated power than solar, wind, biofuels, or any electric alternative for that matter. Liquid fuels are readily portable, meaning that they can be conveniently used to power mobile equipment of any size or weight. Refueling this equipment is rapid and is standardized around the world. By comparison, the electric power systems used for transportation today require longer refueling times than their liquid counterparts, and the physical weight of the battery systems limit the size of the vehicles and equipment they can effectively power. While we expect this situation to improve, These are the conditions we face right now. Still, effectively scaling a new system to this degree will likely be the biggest hurdle of all. Today's battery systems are also dependent on many rare earth minerals, which have a known limitation to their availability. Geopolitically, these critical raw materials will increasingly play a strategic security role in the politics between nations. As we decarbonize, it's also critical that we find an affordable alternative to producing high-temperature heat, something that's essential to many of the industrial processes needed to manufacture these renewable systems themselves. So from the mining of minerals, to the transporting of large renewable energy systems, to delivering the thousands of EVs we're counting on to reduce our carbon footprint, none of that occurs today without fossil fuels playing a prominent role all along the supply chain. All this points to a reality that is a set of very sharp double-edged swords. Climate mitigation on the one hand, and the global economy on the other, and crucial renewable energy in the middle. Simply put, today's biophysical reality, where there really is a limit to growth, seems to be banking on the continued availability of affordable, non-renewable resources. So what do we do? Who's going to pay for all the changes we need? How much time do we have before we reach the tipping point separating success and failure? These are questions that do not have simple answers. Just looking at the time factor, it seems the unspoken conventional wisdom surrounding the world's renewable energy transition is this. If we fall behind the schedule we've set for ourselves, we can just keep doing what we've always done. Continue using fossil fuels a little bit longer. There's a big catch to this, though. Fossil fuel supplies are finite, too. At this point in history, we're seeing the practical limit to how much can be supplied on a daily basis. At SEH, the energy resource data we've studied credibly indicates the tight supplies we're experiencing today is more than a short-term issue, but one that will continue well into the future. Each day there's news about energy shortages around the world. We see it impacting Europe, Asia, and the United States too. Global energy demand is increasing to historic highs with no let-up in sight. As fossil fuel demand surpasses available supplies, logically, it will become more expensive, driving up the price of everything else along with it. Everything. We've all seen what's happened to gas prices over the last year. We know what's happened to the price of other goods too. It's common sense that with the interdependence between fossil fuels and the production of renewable energy systems, the cost of those systems will rise too. We also know the infrastructure the world is counting on to provide the added power to fuel our growing EV demand is in desperate need of update, upgrade, and expansion. For example, we know the lifespan of today's solar, wind, and battery systems range from 15 to 30 years. As I mentioned earlier, each of these is built using rare earth metals, many of which may not remain available at the scale or price needed to continuously retool the entire planet's energy systems into the second half of the 21st century. At Sustainable Energy Hawaii, we're convinced the time for long-term thinking is now. We believe our future energy needs must be viewed not just from a climate mitigation perspective, but also from that of local resilience, sustainability, and from one spanning a multi-generational time frame. To that end, we see a rare, indigenous, essentially limitless source of heat, one our community could choose to respectfully and responsibly transform long-term into usable modern energy. Logistically, that source of heat doesn't need to be imported. It doesn't have to be purchased from a global oil company. It doesn't emit carbon into the atmosphere. Its system's construction uses largely common base metals in its design, and this heat exists under the very islands on which we make our homes. Our geothermal energy supply being constant means the price for the heat it offers won't change over time. This is where we're convinced that our indigenous, steady-state geothermal resource can make a real difference to our lives long term. This could also be the means to support the production of affordable, green hydrogen and jumpstart a new local industry. Every industrialized nation around the world is pursuing the production of green hydrogen. It can serve as a replacement for many functions battery power cannot satisfy efficiently. That includes powering heavy machinery, ocean-going freighters, and even high-capacity airships. This indicates that the export market for affordable green hydrogen has great potential if it can be produced at scale. The benefits of hydrogen are many. It's another way to store electricity, like we do with batteries, but in greater volumes and for longer periods of time. Producing affordable hydrogen has the potential to support local production of nitrogen-rich agricultural ammonia, a necessary ingredient for successful, productive farming. It's also a viable quality source for generating high-temperature industrial heat. With access to that heat, we have the potential to process basalt at scale for local building materials and other products for export. Unlike solar or wind, geothermal energy is a firm, 24/7, 365 power source that doesn't require backup storage. It has a smaller physical footprint per generated gigawatt hour than either solar or wind farms. We believe to properly explore the benefits geothermal power might offer, it will take those in our community, all of whom have a stake in the decisions being made for us today, to collectively voice how we want to live and what we want to leave for future generations. The geothermal conditions that exist here, especially on Hawaii Island, are very special and very rare. We are incredibly lucky to have this amazing resource available when the rest of the world is looking for long-term energy solutions too. Mahalo.
Thank you, Peter, for this very informative and timely video. I'd like to now transition us to our speakers. This next segment will be covered by prominent experts in groundwater and geothermal research. Dr. Don Thomas has been with Hawaii Institute of Geophysics and Planetology since 1980. He currently serves as director of the Center for Study of Active Volcanoes at UH Hilo. Dr. Nicole Lautze is a tenured professor at UH Manoa, where she founded and directs the Hawaii Groundwater and Geothermal Resources Center. She's also on the board of directors for Geothermal Rising and recently completed a 5-year-long geothermal resource assessment across Hawaii. Don, Nicole, it's all yours.
Thank you. I will share my screen. And what I'll do is provide a very brief overview of Hawaii's history with geothermal, as well as a bit of explanation of what I mean when I'm talking about geothermal energy. So what is geothermal energy? Early history of geothermal in Hawaii. Those are the topics I'm going to cover. And a very simple definition is geothermal is heat within the earth that can be extracted in a variety of ways and can be used for a variety of purposes. Now, the very simplest extraction of heat is actual natural production of heat coming to the surface in groundwater. This happens in many parts of the world. And Hawaii doesn't, unfortunately, enjoy natural geothermal features like this. But worldwide, these features actually began the earliest uses of geothermal energy for public spas, for bathing. There are many, many health spas worldwide that take advantage of these natural outpourings of thermal fluids from deep within the earth. This particular image is taken in Italy. And one of our earliest uses of spas in the Western world is actually, this is Bath, England. So when you take a bath, think of geothermal. There were hot springs in England that during Roman occupancy of the British Isles, they built this spa for their use back in the about 200 AD. So we know that geothermal use extends at least that far back. Of course, we also have evidence. These are a fairly famous photo of the snow monkeys in near Nakano, Japan, soaking in the hot springs there. I suspect that actual bathing use of geothermal fluids extends much further back into our history than the Romans. But generation of electrical power is also a major worldwide use of geothermal energy. And of course, it requires a bit more effort. There are multiple ways, multiple technologies for producing that power. I'll give you a very quick summary of those ways right now. In some types of geothermal systems, we have steam contained underground at depths of several hundred to 1,000 or so feet below the ground surface. We can drill down into those steam saturated zones and bring that steam to the surface to drive a turbine. And once that exhaust steam is cooled, that water is reinjected back into that geothermal reservoir to be reheated again. And this is an important concept to understand. The geothermal resource is actually the heat within the rock. The water is simply a mechanism for bringing that heat to the surface and allow us to extract work from that usable heat. Other types of geothermal resources, the reservoir is saturated with liquid water, but under the pressures that are present deep underground, that liquid water can be heated to 600 and more degrees Fahrenheit, drilling a well into that reservoir and allowing that fluid to spontaneously come to the surface. We allow it to flash to steam, to boil to steam. We separate the steam from water, and that steam then is used to drive a turbine to generate power. And the exhaust steam, as well as the liquid brine, can be re-injected back into that reservoir to be heated again. And this is a more common geothermal production mechanism than is the dry steam fields. But the dry steam fields actually began to be used as early as 1904 in Larderello, Italy. And the first actual geothermal power plant was a dry steam plant at Larderello that was putting power onto the local grid in 1914. So this is not a new technology. It's not an experimental technology. The engineering is well established. For lower temperature geothermal systems where the boiling of water is not particularly efficient, we have another mechanism where hot water is brought to the surface to boil a lower temperature boiling fluid. And that lower temperature boiling fluid can be pentane, it can be freon, it can be ammonia, but that vapor generated from that boiling process again drives a turbine to generate power. There are a number of these types of geothermal power production facilities in Nevada, where reservoir temperatures are maybe only in the 300 to 400 degree Fahrenheit, as opposed to the 600 and 700 degree Fahrenheit in the higher temperature reservoirs. And I don't want to imply here that power production is the only thing that can be done with a reservoir. In fact, power production can be combined with a number of other uses. And in fact, industrial process heat for drying, say lumber drying or food drying operations, is by far the most economically advantageous use of that residual heat within the geothermal system. And in fact, in Iceland, this is a fairly well-known photo at the Reykjanes geothermal facility, where they discharge their geothermal fluids out into a pond. And that pond is now a health spa, where it will cost you between $50 and $100 a day to take advantage of soaking in the geothermal fluids and other spa treatments. So there are many options that are available to us in the use of that geothermal energy. With respect to the history of geothermal in Hawaii, we have actually a quite long history that Hawaii was produced by volcanic activity. That volcanic activity extends back at least 75 million years. The Big Island, of course, is much younger than that, only about 1.5 million or so years. But all of the islands were formed from volcanism, and that volcanism has left some residual heat within each of those volcanoes. So Hawaii is likely to have abundant geothermal resources, not just on the Big Island. We suspect that there's also heat within Maui, Oahu, and possibly even Kauai. We have a fairly long history of interest in the use. The early Hawaiian use of geothermal steam at the Kilauea Summit was for cooking food for human consumption as well as for animal feed. That has been reported as extending back at least into the 1800s. And there's a fairly famous conversation that was held during King Kalakaua's visit with Thomas Edison in New York in 1881, where his attorney general asked, I think facetiously, whether the massive amount of heat generated by Kilauea could be used to provide electric light to Hawaii. And Kalakaua was quite the visionary. He made it very clear that he was interested in electric power for electric lights and disliked the use of kerosene, which was the technology of the day, and was hoping to see the technology advance to produce electric lights in Hawaii. And Hawaii, in fact, was one of the first uses of municipal electric lighting. So more recent history, the earliest proponent for geothermal energy in Hawaii was Richard Kailihiwa Lyman. Richard Lyman was born in Hilo, raised in Kapoho. He was an agriculturalist from Puna. He was also a territorial and state senator. He, later years of his life, he was a Kamehameha Schools Bishop of State member of the Board of Trustees. He visited Largarello geothermal field in Italy. And after losing a great deal of productive agricultural land in Lower Puna, he arranged to have a company from the mainland come to Hawaii and drill 4 test wells on the Kilauea East Rift Zone. This is the location of a couple of those wells along the Pahoa Kalapana Road, as well as 2 wells located lower on the rift zone here and here. So he was really the groundbreaking innovator as far as geothermal resources. Unfortunately, those wells were too shallow. They encountered high temperatures, but not high enough to be used for electrical power. The HTPA research well was the first deep well drilled in Puna in 1975 and 76. It was a little over a mile deep and encountered water at 675 degrees Fahrenheit, located right about here. During the 1970s, we had a 4 times increase in the cost of oil in 1973, and again 3 times increase in 1979, which had huge impacts on Hawaii's economy. And it led to the development from the successful demonstration of a high temperature geothermal resource to a small wellhead power plant that operated from 1982 to 1989 and demonstrated that the resource was sustainable. It could produce power for an extended period of time. During this time, we conducted a statewide geothermal assessment and identified prospective resources on all islands. This is a general image showing the East Rift Zone of Kilauea, Mauna Loa, Hualalai, even Kohala, East Maui volcano, and extending up to Oahu and Lanai on Kauai, where prospective geothermal resource areas were located. But this was a very preliminary study and was based on existing data. Now I'll turn the baton over to Dr. Nicole Lautze, who will present more details on recent research and characterization of Hawaii's geothermal.
Yes, thanks, Don. So I'm just jumping right to the chase in what I'm showing on this first slide, which is a map that reflects the probability of a geothermal resource existing in the subsurface on each island in the state, with the red colors being higher probability of a resource. And of course, we see a lot of red on the Big Island of Hawaii, but again, we see red throughout the state, and this surprises a lot of people. So I thought I'd point it out. So this was a 6-year-long statewide geothermal resource assessment funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. Total funding amount was $2.3 million, which might sound like a lot, but as I'll get to, is not a whole lot of money when it comes to doing geothermal exploration. And I'll go through how did we get this probability map so that you think it's believable. But before I do that, I'll kind of echo something Dawn said, which is that we don't see these surface manifestations like other places in the world do see. So this is California. You see a geothermal plant now in this video. In Iceland, there's boiling water. And so that can facilitate geothermal exploration. In Hawaii, we're looking for locations where magma has passed through the subsurface but not erupted. All of our heat in Hawaii is going to be due to that magma. And although the islands are entirely volcanic, that doesn't mean that magma was everywhere. The magma erupts at specific vents, typically localized beneath the caldera and the rift zones of our shield volcanoes. So this cartoon might be a bit informative. Magma comes from deep in the mantle below the caldera and passes laterally from the caldera along rift zones, some kilometers below the surface. And how do we conduct geothermal prospecting in Hawaii? There's 3 main steps. Well, maybe 4. I mean, we first can do geologic mapping to know where we expect the magma pass through the subsurface. And then we can get groundwater data from existing water wells. Step 2, we go out and do a geophysical survey. And so that entails placing some geophysical instruments on the surface and getting a map or an image of what lies below the surface. And then to get the temperature, we need to drill a slim hole. All of this work, I wanted to point out, is trying to understand what's happening in the subsurface. And so there's clearly a connection to understanding our fresh groundwater system. And more recently, Don Thomas and I have gotten involved in looking into carbon storage potential, which also requires a knowledge of what's going on in the subsurface and subsurface geologic structures. In terms of costs, we do these steps in part due to price. So it's cheapest to look at the groundwater data. A geophysical survey costs some tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on how extensive or how difficult the terrain is. And then drilling of a slim hole, and we need to get to 2 kilometers or 6,000 feet roughly, for reasons Dawn mentioned too, because if it's too shallow, we could miss the resource. So that costs between $2 to $3 million. And this image the photo you see here is an image of a drill site to drill a slim hole. So the rig is actually masked behind this shipping container here. It's not a major production to do these slim holes. It requires a crew of about 10 people max, and shipping of the rig and some shipping containers for supplies. It's minimally environmentally impactful. Okay, I'm going to go back to what did we do in this project? Well, in phase 1, we identified and collected existing data relevant to subsurface heat, fluid, and permeability. We need all 3 of those things to constitute a geothermal resource. And I've color-coded these according to geological, geophysical, and groundwater data types. So basically compiled a lot of data. Step 2 was, here's some example data sets. So top left is a map of groundwater temperatures across the state. Top right is gravity data, which is one type of geophysical data on which is overlaid caldera and rift zones. And we incorporated the age of the volcanism as well to go into our probability model. And we also used Hawaiian place names, as the Hawaiian place names were descriptive. So we did kind of an analysis or a screening for things like warm water or stinky rotten egg smell. And incorporated that into our results too. To get to the probability map, basically, I'm not going to go into this, but we did math. So we developed a statistical method to bring all those data, those data into a probability model. Okay, and I'll show that probability model again later. In phase 2, we were allowed to go out and get some more groundwater and geophysical data, which we did the groundwater statewide. Geophysics, we focused on Lanai and Maui, in part because we already have quite a lot of data on Hawaii Island. And in phase 3, we deepened a water well on Lanai. So again, this is the drill site on Lanai. And what I'm showing here is a plot of the subsurface temperature versus depth. And this is versus wells drilled into Kilauea's East Rift Zone or Puna area, which is known geothermal. And so you see kind of Lanai is right in there, but we didn't get deep enough to really tell or see if there's that kind of inflection to a higher temperature. And that's because we were funding limited. So we also didn't drill into the site that we would have drilled had we had ample funding. We drilled into where there was already a well that they were not using. And still, we appear to be onto something. And I think Dawn and I are excited because this is relevant to older volcanoes in the state where perhaps there's higher, and what we know there's need for higher electricity. And so maybe it motivates more drilling to measure those temperatures. So I mentioned groundwater geophysical drilling. Where are we in terms of data collection? Groundwater, we've done a pretty good job screening and collecting groundwater to look for geothermal anomalies or indicators in our groundwater. Geophysics, we've done quite a lot of geophysics across the state. What I'm showing here is geophysics that we've done on the Big Island. So we've done some Kilauea, Mauna Kea, in the saddle between Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa, and a little bit on Kohala. It would be good to do some more on Hualalai and Kohala. Mauna Loa, South Point area too, it's perspective. And it's these data that have really informed our probability map. And so let's look at that again. So yeah, there we go. So it's the groundwater and the geophysical data that have largely fed into this probability map. Where are we in terms of drilling data? We are not so good. So where geothermal exploration drilling has been focused is along Kilauea's East Rift Zone or the Puna region. So here. And that's not surprising because it's a volcanically active rift. And so we know it's the hottest. So we're going to get highest temperatures, most electricity generated. On the yellow star here, that's where PGV is. The orange star is where Don Thomas drilled a well. It was funded by the US Army to look for groundwater and measured elevated temperatures from basically 3,000 to 6,000 feet or 1 to 2 kilometers below the surface. So that was a surprise. And then other than that, the drilling on Lanai was kind of targeted to look for actually both understanding of their groundwater system as well as measure the temperature. And this shows where we did drill. We deepened Lanai well 10, and where our geophysical data showed us would be exciting was to drill into the caldera region, which we missed. And so I guess what I advocate for to really understand, if the state wants to truly understand its geothermal resource, is to come up with $20 million to drill 5 or 6 or 7 of these slim holes. I think that's what's needed next. We could do geophysics first, depending on where we wanted to target. We could have a discussion around where would we want to drill all those wells on Hawaii Island? Would we want to spread them across the islands to try and understand what our temperatures look like? And I guess if 20 million sounds like a lot of money, I scratch my head sometimes saying, what should I say? Because, we spend $1 billion per year importing fossil fuels. And I think geothermal has potential to displace that. Or is it too small of a number? Because we would learn a lot if we had that number, and then we can plan our next steps. With that money, we could talk about how to most intelligently develop and where to develop. It's a little bit of perspective. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I didn't need to show these videos again, but I couldn't figure out how to stop them. Hawaii has 38 megawatts of geothermal energy capacity, basically at one plant, which is PGV. California has 2.8 gigawatts of geothermal, and the California PUC last year put out a mandate to expand firm power generation, so likely mostly geothermal, another gigawatt in the next 5 years. Iceland has 755 megawatts installed, and that's enough for them because they also have quite a lot of hydropower. They're talking about exporting their geothermal resource or electricity to other locations, and they use it for other things, which Hawaii could potentially do too. Our power supply improvement plan here currently has 80 megawatts of geothermal. It's a very small slice. I'd like to see that slice a lot bigger. And just something that was in Peter's movie that I think this visual might help with is basically footprint of these two renewables, solar versus geothermal. So what this image shows is a 26.4 megawatt capacity solar plant and a 33 capacity megawatt geothermal plant. But a really big advantage of geothermal is that it's always on, it's firm. So there's no solar energy production at night. So its capacity factor is 25%, whereas geothermal is 90. Basically, if you do the math, what this shows is that on 10% of the land, you get 4.5 times the amount of energy from the geothermal plant. And if we take that home, if we compare our one power plant, PGV, geothermal power plant, with our largest or formerly largest solar project, the numbers aren't too different. PGV occupies 20% of the land and produces 5.5 times the electricity. And I'll stop there. This Hawaii Groundwater and Geothermal Resources Center, we have a Facebook and Twitter page, and we have a website, which is on this slide. And you see my email, which is very simple, my last name, at hawaii.edu.
Nicole and Don, thank you very much for this. And we will be sharing the information that you've just shared here with the contacts in the report that we'll send out to all of our attendees. Once again, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. Clearly, there's much to know about this process that exists, or this potential that exists across the state. Thank you for contributing to our body of knowledge in this particular space. I'd like to turn this now over to Mike Kaleikini. Mike is Senior Director, Hawaii Affairs for Puna Geothermal Venture, or PGV. This is, as mentioned, Hawaii's sole geothermal energy plant. He's responsible for focusing on the broader aspects of BizDev, public, private, and government affairs in Hawaii. And he has extensive experience with the operations of a geothermal energy plant. Mike?
Thank you, Noel. And aloha mai kako, everyone. Thank you, Sustainable Energy Hawaii, for putting this webinar on and inviting us. Appreciate the opportunity. So I wanted to start off by providing a little background on Puna Geothermal Venture. So we're located approximately 21 miles southeast of Hilo. We are, like Dr. Lautze mentioned, on the Kilauea Lower East Rift Zone. We situated the facility because of the HGPA facility, the success that Dr. Thomas and others had there. And it just made sense, yeah, that's where the resource was. And so in 1993, PGV reached commercial operation for 25 megawatts. And we had such a prolific resource initially with only 2 production wells that we were able to increase an additional 5 megawatts in 3 years. So we went from 25 megawatts in 1993 to 30 megawatts in 1996. And since then, though, we were able to also increase our output to 38. So an additional 8 megawatts. That was in 2012. So we're very excited and appreciative of what's going on. Interest in geothermal. We've had interest in the past, and it looks like there's a lot more going on. And that's the general overview of PGV. I wanted to share with everyone a little bit about our parent company. We are with the Ormat family, the Ormat company that was founded back in 1965 by a husband and wife, Mr. Lucien and Miss Dita Branicki. The Branicki's founded Ormat in 1965. So Ormat has over 56 years of renewable energy technology. We're the only vertically integrated geothermal company. We have 1,100 megawatts of operating facilities, of which 38 is the PGV facility. The majority is in Nevada, there's California. We have international locations in Kenya, Guatemala, and in the French Caribbean and other places. But worldwide, we have contributed to over 3,000 megawatts. So Ormat also manufactures and delivers power plants to third parties. Some of the larger countries that we're at is in the Philippines, New Zealand, Indonesia, Turkey, and several other countries. And that's Ormat, and we're publicly traded, New York Stock Exchange, and our corporate offices in Reno, Nevada. But getting back to PGV, which is near and dear to all of us here, we also are looking, there's a lot of excitement going on, anticipation of additional resource here from our facility. But before I get onto that, I just want to share the recent activities. I think most of us on the webinar is familiar. Recently in 2018, we had that eruption on the East Rift Zone. So we had to shut down for 2 years. We had lava cover 3 of our geothermal wells. It covered our substation, and it did inundate several transmission lines, sections of the transmission lines and the power poles. So that was in 2018. We were fortunate to, so the eruption started on May 3rd and it ended in early August. And it wasn't until the end of 2018 that we were able to get back on location by land, by ground. And so it took us quite some time to refurbish the transmission system with the help of Hawaiian Electric. They were in the lead on that, rebuilt the transmission system that was completed in September of 2020. And then in September, October of 2020, the substation was rebuilt and commissioned. And so the plant actually restarted in early November 5th. And then brings us to where we're at today. We're at about 26 megawatts nominal. So it's a little below 78% of our contractual obligation of 38 megawatts. But our plans for 2022 is to get us back. This is our focus, to get us back to 38 megawatts, right? And so that's kind of what's been happening. It was an exciting time. It was fascinating through that eruption. We had to implement our emergency response plan. We worked closely with civil defense. We worked closely with the governor's office. If some of you may recall, actually the state actually took operational control, and we've informed the task force team of experts from the mainland and experts from ORMAT. And we were able to get all of our wells in a very safe condition. With the 3 that I mentioned that was covered, we've recovered 1 that's back in service. We're working on the second one. So, we designed those wells with the understanding that there could be an eruption. And so our plans as designed actually worked. And so it just shows that we can be resilient. We can bring those wells back in service like we did. So prior to the eruption, PGV and ORMAT was actually engaged with Hawaiian Electric to do a repowered facility. What this entailed basically is to install 3 much more efficient, newer generating units that will replace the 12 generating units that exist at PGV. And because these equipment is newer, it's much more efficient, the results utilizing the same amount of geothermal fluids will result in an 8 megawatt increase. So we actually, in parallel with the rebuild of the transmission system and the substation, ORMAT and PGV actually negotiated a proposal with Hawaiian Electric. That proposal for 46 megawatt repower was submitted to the PUC in December of 2019. So we've gone through the steps of what needs to be done, information requests. There's participants that go back and forth with any concerns and questions. So we propose to delink all of our pricing. The energy rates are going to be some of the lowest available, between 4 and 7 cents a kilowatt hour. And there's not going to be any increase in the rates. It's just gonna stay at 4 to 7 for the duration of the power purchase agreement. It's an amended and restated power purchase agreement, and it's going to extend the term. The existing contract will terminate at the end of 2027, but this new proposal will extend the terms out to 30 years more. So it should, hopefully, if approved, take us beyond 2045, which is the year that the state mandates 100% renewable energy. So we're excited on that. That docket is under review. The last items that we were addressing was environmental review that the PUC wanted us to engage in. And so we are working with Hawaii County on the environmental review process, and we're waiting for the PUC to render a decision on the terms of the amended and restated power purchase agreement. But we were very excited and hoping for a decision to be forthcoming very soon.
Mike, thank you. Thank you very much for sharing all those details related to our journey with PGB. Clearly, there's a lot to be learned there, and we're learning and applying. So thanks very much for that. There are a number of questions that have been raised, which we'll address in the Q&A section. So I'd like to now transition. We will now have Mililani Trask. Mililani is a Native Hawaiian attorney and principal of Indigenous Consultants, a Hawaii-based nonprofit that advises Indigenous peoples on economic development projects. She was an advisor to Hawaiian Power. This is a Hawaiian development group that bid on the last geothermal docket that went before the state PUC. She's also facilitated native energy development in New Zealand, Africa, and Hawaii. Mililani?
Aloha, everybody. I wanted to start out by thanking the SEH group for making a place for me on this panel. Indigenous Consultants is a little company that I put together many years ago when I went to the United Nations. When I got there, they gave me 2 global portfolios. One was health, and the other was Indigenous energy. And that is when I began to look at renewable energy resources and how it interfaced with Indigenous peoples. Indigenous Consultants came online to work with Hawaiian Power, a Hawaiian development company for geothermal, in the last round of activity on geothermal with the PUC. If you want to see the way that we do business, go and look on the PUC website, and you can see all of the things that we filed for Hawaiian. At that time, I did community workshops on all islands in every district here on the Big Island. And we also floated survey instruments so that we could poll our community. The Indigenous Consultants Framework in working with Indigenous resource owners of geothermal is 4 points. And all of our Indigenous partners agree to this when we partner with them. Number 1, that geothermal energy must be developed in culturally appropriate ways. Number 2, development has to proceed in an environmentally way that is clean and green. We are against any kind of geothermal or energy development that toxifies the environment in which we live. So environmental is pretty straightforward, clean and green. But we also think that energy development, whether geothermal or otherwise, needs to be done in a socially responsible way. And also number 4, in a way that is economically equitable. Now, in the state of Hawaii, geothermal belongs to and is owned by the public and the native. It is a mineral defined by law, and so it is in the public trust. Native Hawaiians with a small n, those of us who are 50% bloods, are one of 2 beneficiaries. What about all the Hawaiians that are not 50% blood? Well, they're members of the public. In our state, geothermal belongs to the public and the native. But when it's been developed, there was no seat at the equity table for the public and the native. Instead, the power goes to foreign investors who have the money and others like HECO who do transmission. So when we look at development of geothermal energy that belongs to native people, we ask serious questions. Where's our chair at the table? And where's our share of the benefit? When we look at things that way, we have to take a look at where we are with the County of Hawaii. The seat of geothermal production is right here on the island of Hawaii. The first need we have is obviously to develop geothermal as a base renewable firm power energy resource for our county. But that is not where the inquiry needs to stop. When I look at geothermal, the resources we have, it's plain to see, and I'm speaking as a Hawaiian and a ratepayer from the Big Island, that geothermal is a gateway for other economic development engines that we need on our island. The first one is hydrogen. Hydrogen is a power source that is available to us on the Big Island because the seat of the original energy resource is geothermal. That means to me, and I don't think it's a controversial issue, that when we develop geothermal, we need to plan for the future and develop hydrogen and plan for it at the same time. Geothermal gives us electricity. It's the hydrogen that gives us the heat. Those two come together. There's a third industry that our county will benefit from, and that is to use a share of the energy we have for base salt product development. We have the finest resources, not only in the state, but in the United States for base salt resources. And we need to access those resources to repave our roadways, to fix the bridges that are falling down on the Hamakua coast. And when I talk with others who are looking at base salt production, two of them have told me Hawaii needs to look at just producing one base salt product. The whole world needs it. Black boxes for airplanes. That has a market not only in the US, but globally. So when I look at geothermal, I look at geothermal production for electricity. I look at geothermal as the first step for hydrogen production for our whole state. There's nobody else that can do it. And I look at geothermal for basalt production as well. One thing I want to bring up that is very critical, and I know that the purpose of this Zoom and effort from SEH is to look at energy. But you folks, there is something we can't let fall through the cracks, and that is the critical relationship between energy security and food security. When I went to New Zealand these many years, and I've been many times, I was astounded to see how they're taking geothermal energy and putting it right into hothouse agriculture and increasing their food sustainability. We can't feed the 1 million+ population we have, military and civilian. We can't keep doing it by paying the highest food prices in the United States because we're bringing food in from the continent on big ships running off of fossil fuel. We have the opportunity to move geothermal energy right into food sustainability. We're the only island that has that kind of land available for agriculture, and we're going to need the energy to feed our state. So when I look at the geothermal energy benefits for Hawaii Island and for our people, I look broadly: geothermal, hydrogen, basalt, and food security. This time around, I'm looking at redefining what the PPP means, the public-private partnership. What does that mean for energy? Well, I think that the biggest public consumer, the city and county of Honolulu, the owner of the resource, the native Hawaiian. Let's make seats at the equity table to ensure that the ratepayers of our state don't get stuck with the bill, and to ensure that we're broadening our economic opportunity for our county. We will host geothermal. Why should we not benefit from hydrogen, from food security? I look forward to working with you folks in the future. Let us all remember that we all missed opportunities many years ago when we called for support for geothermal. They chose the sacred place of Tutupele and the caldera, lost millions of dollars and years of time, learned nothing, went down the hill, and then went to Tutupele's sacred forest at Waukele, Puna, and repeated the same mistakes. Work with Native peoples who own the energy. Our goals are economic self-sufficiency and environmental protection. We all have the same goals. We can work together. Look forward to doing it in the future with SEH and with our governments. Aloha.
Hello, Mililani. Your breadth of experience and knowledge are very impressive. Thank you very much for sharing aspects of the socioeconomic and social equity considerations that we need to pay attention to. Really appreciate your passion. I now welcome Representative Nicole Lowen. We're so thankful she's able to join us, actually, given that it's so busy at the state ledge right now. Rep Lowen has been representing House District 6 since 2012. She currently serves as the chair of the House Committee on Energy and Environmental Protection. She also sits on the Agriculture Committee and Judiciary Committee. She's founder of Hawaii's Environmental Legislative Caucus, and she serves on the Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Commission and Hawaii Invasive Species Council. She's also appointed to Electricity Advisory Committee of the U.S. Department of Energy. Nicole?
Thank you. And I have a tough act to follow after hearing from so many great presenters. I'll try to keep it brief. I wanted to start, I guess, with reminding everyone about the state's climate and energy policies, including 100% RPS goal to achieve 100% renewable energy for electricity by 2045, net negative goal to be net negative on our carbon emissions by 2045. And then we also last year declared a climate emergency in Hawaii. So we're recognizing the urgency of climate change and our need to prepare for it and also to reduce our emissions. And then we also have written into state law that we want our energy systems to be affordable, reliable, to reduce reliance on imports, so to be local. Currently we import oil from, I think, primarily Russia and Syria. So that's there's a lot of volatility in those areas, and we need to start doing, shifting to more local resources. And then we also have in state law that we want our energy systems to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. And so I think the question is, does geothermal check all those boxes? And I think that it potentially does. And if it does, there's a tremendous opportunity to expand that resource, to reduce carbon emissions, to reduce electricity costs, and to create incredible new jobs and opportunities in Hawaii, like all the various kinds of opportunities, like Mililani mentioned, food security, but the many other opportunities that just typically go along with access to abundant and affordable energy that could come from geothermal. I think wind and, we have a lot of solar resource development in Hawaii, especially with like a 4-hour battery backup system typically. And I think that really can actually get us pretty far along our path to 100%. But when you do get to the last, 20% or 10%, when you're trying to get to that 100% goal in the future, we are going to need other resources besides just wind and solar. And so, I think geothermal has potential to do that. And it's a technology that's already mature and understood in terms of how you build a geothermal plant. Let's see, I think I can talk a little bit about some of I wanted to make this point. People often ask, are you for or against geothermal? And I think it's a question to me that doesn't always make sense, because it's like asking, are you for or against hotels? It really depends on the project. So when there has been opposition to projects in the past, I think people have, we don't want to disregard people's concerns to that and try to force geothermal projects through. They need to be sited in a place that's appropriate, where there's not conflicting uses between residential and industrial uses. You have to consider the environmental impacts and make sure those are mitigated for and plan a good project. And so it is a project by project kind of consideration. And we have to, I think, keep that in mind as we talk about geothermal. There's a few bills in the legislature this year. I introduced one which would just reallocate how the geothermal royalties are paid. Currently, the 20% goes to OHA. That would not change. And of course, if there was any development on DHHL land, 100% of the royalties would go back to DHHL, and that should stay that way. And then currently 50% go to the State Land Development Special Fund and 30% to the county. So my bill would just shift that to reduce the amount that goes into the state and increase the amount that goes back to the county where these royalties are generated, and then add some stipulation in there that those funds should be used to look into how we can further geothermal or further the conversation about geothermal. And so there's also a bill, I think, introduced by Senator Dela Cruz to appropriate $500,000 to DHHL for DHHL to look at possibilities for developing resources on DHHL land. I guess I would just I'm happy to answer questions. I don't have the same amount of direct experience with developing projects or doing the science that Nicole and Peter do, but I do think that we have to keep in mind, like, you cannot just dismiss the concerns to the public. And I think to not address that there has been a lot of opposition to geothermal in the past would be kind of not addressing the elephant in the room. So that's going to be an obstacle that we have to work to overcome, and we'll have to work with community to do it. And I think, what can people do? I mean, I think if you do support exploring the potential opportunity for geothermal, and that's not to say we're supporting a specific project, because we don't know what those projects are or exactly where they'll be or exactly what they'll do. But if you do support the idea of exploring the possibility of having more geothermal and sort of ending what has felt like a little bit of a taboo conversation almost in recent years, and that's part of why I introduced a bill this year, is because we need to keep talking about it if we want to see this explore this opportunity in the future. But I think you can reach out to your legislators and other leaders and express your support for that. I think a lot of times we do tend to hear, the most negative messages tend to get amplified and in the media these days, and we tend to hear from the louder voices more. So I think everybody should chime in. I mean, like I said, can't say whether or not I would support a specific project that has yet to be proposed, but I very much support exploring the opportunities that developing a local, abundant, affordable, and a low carbon emission source of energy could bring. It could be just a tremendous boon for Hawaii Island, and we can't just shut it down and say, like, well, we can never do this. I think that we have to continue to push this conversation and explore the possibility. And I'll stop there, but thank you.
Nicole, thank you so much. Really appreciate you putting an emphasis on the need to take a look at all the different angles, the different considerations, including social equity, local concerns, et cetera, as we go through specific projects. So also appreciate your introduction of the policy and regulatory considerations. There's a question in the chat about the number, the bill number. So we can input that, and we'll share that also with the audience in the email that we send out. So thank you very much again for all you do, including your focus on the climate crisis and finding ways for us to, get beyond that in a very equitable and, socially relevant way. To all of our speakers, I'd like to thank you again for your wide range of information and perspectives. I'm sure we do actually have a number of questions to address, and I'd like to now move us into this Q&A part of our event. We're really short on time, so apologize that we're not able to get to all the questions, but we promise to get the answers and then publish that in an email that we send to all the registrants. So with that, we'll go into Q&A, and I have a few questions here that Peter has shared with me, and I'll just raise it, and I guess folks on the panel who would like to respond, please do. So one question here that came from Amanda I'll just read it. Has there been any collaboration with the Maori tribes in New Zealand who have very successfully harnessed geothermal based on Polynesian values? And maybe Mililani, I think you may have hinted at work in New Zealand. Do you want to address that?
Yes, you know, the Maoris work with geothermal is very, very inclusive. They not only work with their own government, but they have relationships with others internationally. They know what is happening up in Iceland because they're looking for ways to broaden what they're doing with geothermal. But the Maori are also very open to working with others, including those in the Pacific region, which is not only Polynesia, but Micronesia and Melanesia as well. And that is why I was able to see and understand they have a more holistic view of geothermal. And one of them told me, you know, it's not gonna help us. It doesn't help us to have affordable electricity and then everyone goes home and they don't have the money to put food on the table. In the Maori way of looking at it, they link energy directly to food security. And it's that kind of a relationship that have helped me to broaden my understanding of what geothermal could mean to Hawaii and to Hawaii's food security. Everyone pays the same cost for food. It's not that Hawaiians get a benefit, but also I learned something from the Maori, and that is you have a strong, culturally based initiative, and you hold to those principles. Work with geothermal partners that respect the indigenous principles, work with them. And those that do not work with them. And it's really through the Maori experience, I began to look at how EDC in the Philippines works with their projects, how AECOM in New Zealand works with their projects. So the partnerships with other Native peoples, including Maori, are very instructive for us. I've gleaned a lot.
Thank you, Mililani. I think the essence there is what you just said, right? Engage, learn, and embrace. So Thank you very much for that.
Exactly.
This next question came from Henry. Looking in active volcanic zones show where sites most vulnerable to disruptions due to eruptions occur. These sites will not be good for the long term, right? So it's essentially a question about the safety and long-term safety considerations for investigating geothermal in volcanic zones. So Don or Nicole Lautze, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'm glad to start. Don, you can jump in. I didn't have time to go through the entire project, but we actually considered what was called we call development viability when we went from phase 1 to phase 2 of the project. And there's an entire paper on development viability that's downloadable from our website. You could send me an email and I could direct you to that. And natural hazards was one element of what we considered in that. Also access to a grid, land use. So we just didn't even advise exploring in urban areas or national parks. What was the fourth one, Don? Community acceptance, I think it was. So the community element is that's been discussed is not, I mean, it's very much on our radar. And for the work on Lanai, we made a dedicated effort to work with the community, had an open house during the drilling itself so that they could come and see what we were doing. And I think that went very well. So I agree, before we go into a community and do a project, we need to engage with that community for sure.
One of the things that is very apparent from what you had shared earlier is that the energy potential exists not only at the rift zone but other locations as well. So that that's very promising, I should say. This next question is, I'm just gonna, yes, Mike.
I'd like to add to what Nicole was saying and to respond to Henry's criticism.
Sure, go ahead.
So one thing to bear in mind with geothermal is that a project or a facility will be sited where the resource is located. And thus, that's why in our case, we're on the rift zone. So companies like Ormat and other companies understand the risks of being near rift zones or tectonic plates, etc. So yes, I mean, Henry's correct. There is that hazard portion, yeah, that you have to take into account. But we as a geothermal developer understand those risks. We have other facilities throughout the world that are on rift zones, right? And we've experienced eruptions and ash flying all over the plants, etc. But part of it is, like I mentioned a little bit, is how you design the facility to come back, right? Yes, there was a 2-year delay. So a nice thing about consideration is perhaps like what Dr. Lautze was stating is look at other locations. Don't put our eggs all in one basket, spread it out around the island. So it can be addressed, the hazards of being on the rift zone. Any other facility, power plant that's near the ocean, they're subject to a tsunami, right? There's other natural hazards. It's just that we're on a rift zone. So that additional hazard of an eruption is definitely there. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you for that perspective, Mike. I really appreciate that. We probably have maybe time for 2 more questions, and we're going to do a quick wrap up, at 11:30. So this next one is, have you studied the structures that can conduct the geothermal fluids? And if this is the case, did you focus your well targets in those structures? It looks like it's very specific to exploration, maybe Don or Dr. Lautze.
Sure, I can take that. We do look for regions where the geothermal fluids are coming closer to the surface. And that is really a fundamental part of the exploration program. The geophysical surveys, the sampling of groundwater. In fact, in Lower Puna, the reason that it was selected as a high priority target, how many years ago, 50 years ago now, was because there were so many surface features indicating that thermal fluids were coming close to the surface. So indeed, yes, we do look at those kinds of things, and that is part of the exploration strategy.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Does anyone else have anything to add to that? Okay. So the last question is probably a generic question and applies to any of the speakers here. What are the major resistance to developing geothermal power in Hawaii? Technical, political? So I know we kind of touched on some of these points during the course of this meeting, but I'm wondering if there's anything else that anyone would like to add that we should be aware of.
Well, I'll just make a real brief stab at that. I heard a term used many years ago that I think describes one of the fundamental problems we face, and it was termed a LULU, a locally unwanted land use. The land uses that are compatible with geothermal, sort of from a philosophical point of view, are very difficult to reconcile. It was commented here that you should not do it in residential areas. So geothermal is incompatible with a residential area. But if we go away from residential areas, we are now in conservation zones. And so in many people's minds, geothermal development in a conservation or an area that is not heavily occupied is also incompatible. And at some point, we're going to have to find a way to resolve those conflicts.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'll add.
Mike?
Yes, thank you. I'll add a little bit. Yeah, so definitely you have to address the nearby communities, right? And you have to take into account whatever concerns folks have. I mean, that has been part of the challenges for the years that PGB has been there. That's one part of it. The other part is there is this process that you have to follow through, but it takes time, right? You gotta get permits. You gotta go through the PUC. It takes time. So there may be ways. I know several years ago, Act 97, it did away with the subzones for geothermal. And that was an initiative to try and streamline and promote more geothermal development. It hasn't done much, I don't think. I mean, you can see by what I shared, we're from 25 to 38 in almost 30 years, right? And so it's a combination of all those things. Situating a facility, you have to take into account your surroundings, and you don't want to have a lot of folks there. So that's something I think that future development, if we do have any, needs to consider.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, we have come up to the end of our event here. There's some thanks coming through the chat. There's a lot of information in the chat and the Q&A, including questions that we did not get to. And we will be, to our panelists, those questions, we will reach out to you individually, compile the responses, and then we're going to be sharing that with all the registrants for this particular event. I'd like to thank all of you, our presenters, Dr. Thomas, Dr. Lautze, Mike, Mililani, Rep. Lowen. Really appreciate your insights and experience and knowledge that you shared today. This clearly is the start of a discovery. We look forward to engaging with all of you again in the future. And to our audience, thank you for your interest and engagement. I will share a little on the screen right now. This is our upcoming event, which will be a follow-through to this particular webinar. And it will allow us to do a deeper exploration into the community, cultural, environmental, and regulatory related concerns. This is happening on the 19th. There's the URL here. Let me just put this in the chat. You can actually, if you haven't registered yet, you can register there, and we will be continuing this wonderful conversation and discovery. So with that, thank you very much for your time. Hopefully this was very informative and helpful, and we'll definitely be engaging with everybody who is registered and participated. Thank you. Aloha.